together. So if you have your Bibles, turn with me to Matthew chapter 7, verse 13 and 14. Matthew chapter 7, verse 13 and 14. Hmm. Hmm. If we're there, will someone read that for us, please? Matthew chapter 7, verse 13 and 14.
Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only few find it.
All right. So many of us have heard have heard this verse. So up to this point in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has described for us what righteous character, what the character of the kingdom looks like. He's laid down for us the ethics and values of those who are citizens of the kingdom. He's defined for us what real spirituality looks like. It's not an external performance thing, it's an internal thing. He's laid out for us what it means to look at and to deal and relate with others from a standpoint of not judging critically and condemning. And now he brings it all together and he says, listen, you need to do something with this stuff. And what you need to do with this is you got to enter. He said, I've given you all this stuff. Now there's something that you have to do with this. Now, let me lay this foundation. So that's our opening text. So remember what we said about the Sermon on the Mount from the very beginning is it is a transitional bridge between the Old Testament and the New Testament. What Jesus is seeking to do is to connect the two dispensations of God, that God is continuing his plan and his strategy that he laid out in the Old Testament, which is about a king and its kingdom, that Jesus came to connect and to bridge both systems. And why is that important? Because anyone remember when we first jumped into the Sermon on the Mount, and when chapter 5 opens up, it gives the picture of Jesus going up on the mount, and then he sits and he begins to teach. Does anyone remember what we said, that picture of Jesus going up on a mount and sitting before he teaches, what that is an illustration of?
Wasn't that example of Moses when he gave the commandments?
Exactly. Exactly. It's given the picture of Moses. Why? Again, Moses gave the law from Mount Sinai, the law that governed the Old Testament. Now, in the Sermon on the Mount, which we are coming to the end of, Jesus in chapter 5 goes up on the mount, sits down, and he gives the new law of the New Testament kingdom. He gives the new law of the New Testament kingdom. So he stands, the illustration, the imagery that God is giving us is one of consistency and continuation. Moses went on the mount, gave the law. Jesus went on the mount and he gave the law. Now, when Moses gave the law back in the Old Testament, I'm going to give you two sets of verses here in Deuteronomy. I'm going to give you Deuteronomy 11, verse 26 to 28, and then we give you Deuteronomy 30, just so that you could see and understand the imagery that God is trying to provide for us. And that imagery helps us to take grasp of the truth that's being laid out. So Deuteronomy 11, 26 to 27, someone read that for us, please.
See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today. And the curse, if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn from the way that I am commanding you today to follow other gods that you have not known.
Okay. Now let's go look here at Deuteronomy 30.
I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live.
See here in these verses, Moses utters a challenge to the people of God. It's a challenge. The challenge is to choose life or death, blessing or curse. Now, Jesus, as the new Moses, sets forth a new commandment, a new challenge that he's laid out before them. And the challenge is the same challenge of life and death, blessings and a curse. Jesus calls it the narrow way or the wide way. And what Jesus is saying here, it's up to the people who would be his disciples. It's up to them as to whether or not we are going to obey, whether we are going to follow, whether we are going to align ourselves to the instructions of life that he has laid out in our text. Moses laid out the principles of the Old Testament and said, what you going to do with this? Because you only got two choices. Now Jesus has taught and laid out all this stuff in the Sermon on the Mount, and he says, what you going to do with this? What you going to do? You going to take the narrow way or the wide way? He poses a choice. Jesus laid out his teaching framework. He says, listen, this is about the internal character of your heart, the attitudes of your heart and your mind as it relates to God. This is about your influence in the world, whether or not you are going to be salt and light in the world. This is about whether or not you're going to have a spirituality that's devoid of hypocrisy, whether you're going to live life in the closet, so to speak, with understanding that it's not about what men say about you, but it's about what God says about you. All of these teachings, all of these principles, all of these concepts that Jesus lays out from the beginning of chapter 5 up to this point, all of them having to do with how the governing principles and guidelines of the kingdom are lived out. How is it God, others, and myself? Jesus is saying, listen, you have a choice. Moses said, you have a choice. You have to decide. Here in Matthew 7:13 and 14, Jesus is saying, you have to decide. He gives us two binary options. Two binary options, one or the other. There's no middle ground. Not binary just means you got two options, one or the other. And in this verse, he uses these imageries and he says there's two gates. One is the small gate or wide gate. Some of your translation says narrow gate. There's two paths that you can follow, the narrow or the broad. There's two groups that you can travel in. You can travel in with the few, you can travel in with the many. And there's two destinations, life or death. Jesus is concluding this sermon and he says, guys, you've heard my teaching, you've heard my instructions. Now you have to decide. And the first decision he says that they have to make, back to verse 13, he says, You can enter God's kingdom only through the narrow gate. Some of your other translations simply says enter through the narrow gate. First decision we have to make is to enter. Jesus is saying it's not enough just to hear. I have to decide. There's an action that's required on my part. And this word enter that we see here, it's an imperative command. It's Jesus is saying, listen, make a choice. Urgently decide. Don't sit on the fence. There's an immediacy that's stressed in the root of that word enter. It's almost as if he's yelling, do it now. Hurry up. Get moving. Don't hesitate. Enter God's kingdom. Time's running out. The gate won't always be open. There's an imperative, there is an intensity to this first statement in 13 that in the translations, it doesn't necessarily carry, but when you look at the root of the word, there is an urgency that Jesus is stressing. Jesus demands from you and I a choice. He demands a choice. He demands from the world a choice. He says, enter God's kingdom. Hurry up. Don't waste time. Don't hesitate. Don't delay. Why? Because the only way you can enter God's kingdom is through the narrow gate. Now, some of your translations may not say narrow gate. It may say straight gate, not straight as if an arrow is straight, but that word straight means narrow. It means constrained. It means difficult to enter. Hurry up. Make a decision to enter God's kingdom. But the way that we enter God's kingdom is through a way that is straight, that is narrow, that is constrained. The entrance into the kingdom, it's an intentional decision. It's an intentional decision that's driven by an action or a pathway that is narrow, that's constrained. What do you think what makes entrance into the kingdom, the pathway to enter into the kingdom, the gate, what makes it narrow?
I would say maybe it's narrow because of the things basically you have to give up, or the thing that you have to let die in yourself. So you have to follow a specific path that is different than the world, and the world's path is a lot easier because it's broader. There's so many things that you can choose, but God's path is specific, and you have to give up yourself and you have to die to self to choose that path.
Hey, Dave, can I piggyback? I was going to also piggyback, going to say the gates are narrow because of the requirements that it takes to enter the gates.
Listen. Jesus is saying, listen, the way to the kingdom, if you're going to respond to the urgency of the call, the urgency of the command, Jesus is saying, you can't just come in any old way. And then when you think about all the things that all the teaching we've done up to this point in the Sermon on the Mount, this is what defines the constraints. This is what defines the narrow way. This is what defines the narrow road. That if we are going to enter into the kingdom, we just can't come any way we want. It's narrow because, as Ray said, there's stuff we got to strip off. Remember Jesus said this, that when he when he approached the rich young ruler, and the rich young ruler wanted to get into heaven, he said, Lord, tell me, listen, tell me, I keep all the commandments, I do all of this, tell me. And Jesus, tell me how I can inherit eternal life. And Jesus said, okay, I'll tell you what you do. Go and sell all the stuff you got. And my man was like, I'll get up with you, Jesus. I'll check in with you, brother, next week. And he walked away. And the Bible says that he was sad because he had a lot of stuff. And Jesus said, it is easier for a camel to enter in through this one particular gate in Jerusalem that everybody was aware of. It was a real small gate. He says, it's easier for that camel to get through that gate than it is for a rich man to get to heaven, because he won't unburden himself from the things that make it physically impossible for him to get through. And the imagery that Jesus is giving to us is that if we are going to enter and experience the good life, if we're going to be not just churchgoers, not just cultural Christians, but if we're really going to experience the good life, not the good life according to the standards of the world, where it's all about the money you make, the house you live, the car you live in, the neighborhood you live in, all that, but according to the standards of the kingdom, what does it really mean to have blessings, to be blessed, the Beatitudes? He says, then you're going to have to be willing to have yourself constrained. You're going to have to be willing to have some limitations on your behaviors. And that's all the teachings that Jesus has laid up to this point. The other thing that makes it narrow, is the gate itself. Notice, look what Jesus said in John 10:9. Someone read that for us, please.
I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. He will come in and go out and find pasture.
So here, and there's multiple verses where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Multiple statements that Jesus makes that indicate the fact that he is the gate. He is that narrow gate. There's no broad way that you can get into the kingdom of God. It's a very specific, narrow way that has very specific, narrow constraints on it. Jesus says, you can't get into the kingdom if you don't come through me. But here's the thing, though. Help me, Lord. Help me. Because I can't disconnect this statement from all that Jesus started teaching about character and ethics and values and principles and forms of spirituality, all that stuff in the Sermon on the Mount. This is how he concludes all of this. And he says, listen, you can't get into the kingdom with your own standard. All this stuff that I've been teaching, you've got to embrace this stuff, and you've got to come through me. You can't say, hey, I'm coming into the kingdom. Yeah, I believe in Jesus, but not want to be obedient to any of his teachings and his concepts. The church has created this, Lord, help me. The church has created this ideal, this concept that says, I can accept Jesus, I can get saved, but I don't have to live nothing. I can enter into the narrow gate, but I don't have to travel on the narrow road. Let me say that again. The church has taught you can enter in the narrow gate, but you don't have to travel on the narrow road. And Jesus is saying, no, you got to choose. You got to decide. Why must we choose and decide? Because again, God has a very specific governing principle for his kingdom. God, others, and myself. Now watch what Jesus says. So in the second part of 13, he talks about the gateway to destruction. Look what he says. He says, hey, you can enter God's kingdom only through the narrow gate. And then he says this, the highway or the wide road to destruction is broad and its gate is wide. And there are many that travel in it. He's given a contrast. He says, listen, if you want to get into the kingdom, man, that's a very constrained, narrow, limited way. But there's a way that's wide, that's broad, it's not limited, it's not constrained. You can live any old kind of way you want. You can do whatever you want. But man, that way, a lot of people are on that road, but that road has a destination. And the destination of that road is destruction. There are 21 major religions in the world and 33 divisions within those religions. 21 major religions in the world. That's the broad way. And many there are that travel therein. But let's not just look at the world. Just here in the United States, there are over 200 different denominations. 200 different denominations within the church, each claiming some sort of proprietary access to the kingdom. That our way, our doctrine, our teachings, how we hold service, how we do this, how we do that, the day we worship, all this stuff is proprietary to get to the kingdom. All of them thinking that their way is the narrow way. But Jesus says, no, that's the broad way. Proverbs 16:25 tells us, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its ends is the ways of death. He says, enter through the narrow gate. You want the good life? You want to experience relationship with God? You want to receive what the Father has because he desires to give us the kingdom? Jesus says, if you want that, there's a narrow way. And he's going to talk about that a little more. As opposed to, there's a wide way. Don't go with the crowd. Don't go with the way that is broad. Why? Because that way is easy. That way doesn't require anything from you. And it leads to destruction. Now, a lot of people have taken that verse and they've taught it, and not necessarily completely wrong, but they've taught it from the standpoint of, well, that leads to hell. And certainly, if you don't have a relationship with God through faith in the atonement of Jesus, that's your destination. But it's speaking of something more immediate, because most people in life, they don't think about what's going to happen after they die. They're trying to get all they can now, right? They ain't worried about that. I'll deal with that when I get to that, right? But what they're saying here, what the psalmist is saying, and even what is being said here, that this broad way, this broad gate, this wide road, it leads to destruction. That word destruction refers to loss. It means to come to ruin. The Bible says this, that the way of the sinner is hard. Jesus says we have to decide which road, which gate, because whatever gate I enter into, that puts me on a certain road. Think of it as going through a toll booth. You go through a toll booth, it puts you on a certain road, right? You can't get on that road unless you go through the toll booth. So Jesus says there's a gate, there's a toll booth, and that toll booth, the cost to get on that is high. There's a high cost to go through that toll booth because there's restrictions on your liberty. There's requirements of lifestyle and commitment and obedience, and that road, it's a high price. He said, but then there's this other road, and it's cheap to get on that road. Heck, it's free to get on that road. There's no restrictions, no constraints. Man, that road seems like it's going to get to where you want to go fast. Everybody's traveling on that road. He said, but that road leads to ruin. That road leads to loss. That road will never allow you to experience the life of the kingdom. That road will never allow the individuals who travel on that road to experience the purpose, the meaning, the significance for which God made and created them. The wide gate. The wide road. And there's many that choose to follow that way. Why follow the broad way? What are some of the things that cause people to take the easy road? What is just open rebellion? I'm grown. I'm going to do what I want, when I want, how I want. It's my life. Get out of my business. There's open rebellion to God. Then there are people who think they can choose later. Well, I'm going to travel down this road. I know that this road leads to destruction. I know this road leads to loss. I know that this isn't the road that leads to the life my grandmother told me about. I know this ain't the road that leads and aligns with that voice I hear in my heart that's telling me choose another way. I know this road isn't leading there, but I'm going to travel on it, and eventually I'm going to take an exit, and I'm going to get on the right road. That's what I thought. See, when I was on the broad road through the easy gate, I always knew God called me, and I just figured I'll have my fun out in the world, and then when I'm done, I'll hook up with God later. Not realizing that it almost cost me my life when I got stabbed 9 times and laid up in the hospital. That's one of the reasons why people follow the broad road. Another reason why people follow the broad road is what I call religious spiritualism. They say, hey, I believe in God. You know, I believe in a God. I believe there's a God, but who's to say which one? Who's to say, hey, this one is better than that one, right? How do you Christians know that your way is the right way? Aren't all religions equal? Another reason why people follow the broad way. Because again, all of these are pathways that don't require anything out of your lifestyle or conduct. The other reason people follow the broad way is they say, well, I don't need Jesus. I just need to be a good person. I can earn my way to heaven. I just need to be a good person. I just need to do good things. And I can be okay with God. These are all different motivations for why people will follow the broad way. Can you think of any other reasons why people take the broad way?
Could it be the, go ahead, Shayla.
It's easier.
Yeah, yeah. Because you know, I ain't gotta forgive people that hurt me. I ain't gotta love people I can't stand. I can just give into my flesh whenever my flesh wants it, right? It's easier. And Shayla, that's perfect that you said that, because that's the imagery Jesus is trying to give when he says, listen, the kingdom, it's a narrow gate and it's a narrow way or a narrow road. Outside of the kingdom, it's a wide gate and it's a wide road. There's no restrictions. There are no limitations. It's easier. And the reason people follow it is because it is easier. What are some of the other examples of why people stay on the wide road?
Pastor,
No.
my brother, unfortunately, he believes that there is only one God, but he believes all gods are the same God.
Yep.
He's so lost, it's pathetic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that religious spiritualism. I believe in God. All roads, listen, all roads lead to God, right?
Hmm. You've heard some people say, oh, God, forgive me, grace, you know, that's a big one.
Yeah, God will forgive me. Yeah.
Mhm.
Also, Dave, what about accountability? We don't like to be accountable.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's that rebellion. I want people up in my business, my Kool-Aid, tell me what to do, when to do it, how to do it. Yeah. And let's put this back in its framework here. He's using imagery to talk about how do I actually live out the principles of the kingdom? How do I actually become a citizen of the kingdom? What are the requirements of citizenship? And the reason the gate is narrow is because the entry point is limited. The entry point is limited because it's through one person, Jesus. It's the narrow gate. The road is narrow because it's constrained. There are limits. You can't live any way that you want to live. You can't just do anything that you want to do. Let me speak to myself because I'm using you a lot. I can't do what I want to do. I can't live the way that I want to live without a sense of obligation and responsibility to the name that I profess. That's what makes it narrow. That's why the gate is narrow and the road is narrow. Jesus is saying, if you want to be in the kingdom, you have to understand your life will have constraints. But those constraints, we're going to see in the next verse, there's a benefit to them. And he's balancing that with this ideal of, hey, there's this wide gate, man. It's wide. You know, it's free access in and out. Again, it's the cheap toll booth. It'll put you on the super highway. Everybody's on there, man. Cars are flying, they're speeding, and it seems like it's going to get you to your destination quickly. But man, that road leads somewhere you don't really want to go. He's laying out these choices for us. Life and death, blessings and curse. Wide gate, narrow gate. Wide road, narrow road. Life, death. Run with the few, run with the many. Same binary. And what's really important to understand here is, let me do this. I'll touch on it here. So he gives us this warning about the wide way, the wide gate that has no limitations. That's the easy way. And then he says, there's a different way. There's a gateway that leads to life. Verse 14. Verse 14, he comes out of his statement, you can enter God's kingdom only through the narrow gate, because the highway to destruction is broad, and its gate is wide for the many that choose to follow that way. And then he transitions to talk about the gateway to life. He says, but the gateway to life is very narrow, and the road is difficult, and only a few find it. The gateway to life. If I want to experience, that word life is, some of your translation says narrow is the way that leads to life. That word life is the word Zoe, Z-O-E, and Zoe speaks to the quality life of the kingdom, the life of the kingdom. So Jesus is saying, listen, if you want the life of the kingdom, the way you enter into that life, it's narrow. There are limits. There are limits. There's constraint. And then he said this. Lord, help me. My mind is going 5 different places. Then he said this. The gate, think of it as a toll booth in your mind. There's a high price on this toll booth. The gate's narrow. It costs. But then he talks about the road. And he said the road is difficult. And there's only a few that find it. What do you think he means when he says the road is difficult? What is difficult about the road that leads to life?
Could it be challenging?
Okay.
Because of the constraints, you're going to find yourself wanting to go back to what you used to do.
Yep. Challenging, constraints. Yeah, that word difficult, it stresses the experiencing of many hardships and tribulations along the road. Just stop for a moment. Just stop for a moment, and let's just think about this. Jesus is saying, listen, you got to choose and decide. You only get 2 choices. You can go through the wide gate, get on that wide road, and that road leads to ruin. It leads to loss. You can't experience the life of the kingdom on that road. It's the easy road. Everybody's traveling that road. It seems like the right thing to do. And then he comes back and he says, but the way to experience the life of the kingdom, he said, it's very narrow. It's very constrained. It takes commitment. It takes more than a casual effort. And then he says, and it's difficult. In the original language, again, there's hardships and tribulations. Think about those of us who have been in the church for a while. Think about the messaging about relationship with Christ that we send to people. Because here Jesus is saying, listen, if you want in, you're going to have to go through something. If you want in, you got to be willing to accept some limitations. You have to be willing to accept some constraints. This isn't a smorgasbord. You can't pick and choose how you want your standards. You can't invent your own model of Jesus. No, he's the gate. He's the narrow way in which you come. And when you come through him, you can't come through your religion. You can't come through your denomination. You can't come because your grandma was an evangelist in the church. Your uncle was a deacon or somebody in your family was a pastor. No, that's not the gate you can come in. It's Jesus. It's not morality. It's Jesus. And when you come in through Jesus, you're going to have a hard time. That's what he's saying. The road is difficult. It stresses experiencing many hardships. Remember, Jesus told his disciples, what did Jesus say to his disciples about hard times? Anybody remember?
I think he said, I'm going to paraphrase, if the world hates you, remember that they hated me first. Yep. And about that, I think.
Yep. Now you got it. You got it. He said, listen, the servant isn't greater than his master. I experience hard times. You're going to experience hard times. Jesus said, in this world, you're going to experience tribulation, but take courage. I've overcome the world. Peter said, think it not strange, these fiery trials which must come your way. For the testing of your faith worketh patience. Therefore, let patience have its perfect work, that you may be thoroughly complete, lacking nothing. The Bible consistently reinforces the ideal that once we pass through the narrow gate, which is Jesus, the road is difficult. It's challenging. But that's not what we tell people, is it? We tell people, you can come through the gate. You can come through the narrow gate, but live like you're on the wide road. And what Jesus is trying to get you and I, forget about everybody else, you and I, here's what Jesus is saying to us today, guys. We have spent months going through in detail the teachings on the Sermon on the Mount. And now I believe God is saying to us is, guys, what you gonna do with this? What you gonna do with this? Now, if you want the good life, you've already accepted Jesus. You've already come through the narrow way, the narrow gate. But I think what the Lord is saying to us is, are you willing to travel on the difficult road? Are you willing to incorporate into your spiritual walk some disciplines? Are there things that you are willing to allow to constrain your life? Are you willing to become uneasy? That's the question. And then notice what he says at the end here. At the end, he says, the gateway to life is narrow. The road is difficult. The road has hardships. And he says there's few who ever find it. There are few that ever find it. I'm thinking of the TV commercial, the Marines. What's the saying for the Marines?
The few, the proud, the Marines.
I didn't think you'd say it, Marv. You're an Army man. You're like me.
I know. They was crazy.
The few, the proud, the Marines. What is the sentiment there? That there's something elite about the few. There's something special about the few. And Jesus is saying, do you want to be with the few, or do you want to be with the many? See, the many will say, we got grace, so you really don't need to be on that narrow road when it comes to your sexuality. Travel on the wide road when it comes to your sexuality. God knows you got needs. He'll understand if you sleep around a little bit. It's okay. Go with the many. It's okay if you have unforgiveness and prejudice and racism in your heart. That's okay, because that's where the many is. God understands. God knows. It's okay. Don't go with the few. That's too hard. That's too difficult. That's too legalistic. And when you think with that template, just start laying that template across our own lives. Where are we choosing? Where are we choosing to go down the wide road versus the narrow road? And here's what Jesus is saying to us. He's saying, listen, there comes a point where you have to decide. Then he gives this warning. We'll close out with this. Then he gives us this warning, right? And these verses, again, so oftentimes we think about them. We've heard them, but we've heard them in isolation. We haven't heard them in the full context. So here Jesus says, listen, you got two choices on the road that you're going to follow. You got two choices. You can either go through the small gate or the wide gate. You can either be on the narrow path or the broad path. You can either travel with the few or with the many. And you can either choose life, the life of the kingdom, or death. And death simply means receiving all that the world has to offer, right? And then he gives this warning. After he lays all this out, there's a warning that he gives. And many of us have heard this verse, but we haven't heard it in context. So Matthew 7:15, look what he says. He says, beware of false prophets who come disguised as harmless sheep, but are really vicious wolves. So he says, listen, the road you choose is important. The gate and the road you choose is important. It's life and death, blessings and a curse. And then he says, listen, you need to be careful about where you get your direction from. You need to be careful about the instruction that you receive, the spiritual instruction. He says there's some false prophets that are out there, and they look right on the outside, but really on the inside, they're not right. And they're going to give you some bad instruction if you're not careful. Because the bad instruction they're going to give you is going to lead you to choose the wrong option. Instead of the narrow gate, you're going to take the wide gate. Instead of the narrow road, they're going to lead you down the broad road. Instead of traveling with the few, they're going to tell you it's okay to travel with the many. Instead of leading you to life, they're going to lead you to death. He says, beware of false prophets. Beware of false teaching, erroneous teaching, teaching that makes the kingdom seem as if it's the wide road, it's easy, it's simple, it's wide, no requirements. Then he says, not only do you have to watch out for bad direction, then he says you need to have discernment. And I think that's one of the things that's so missing in the body today, that we don't have discernment. And the reason we don't have discernment is we don't have a basis to discern from. We are so rooted in churchianity rather than biblical principle and precept, we can't discern. We don't have the right measurement to measure something against. And watch what Jesus says. How do I know I got people teaching me the wrong stuff? He says, you can identify them how?
By
the
their
way
fruit.
By the way they act.
You can identify them by their fruit. That is, by the way they act.
Mm-hmm.
He says, just look on the road they're traveling.
Yeah.
Just look at the road they're traveling. And unfortunately, man, I got to say this.
Doesn't it conflict with the whole not judging thing, though?
No, because the not judging is based on what?
Looking down upon.
In the heart, yeah. How you do it, your motives. Mm-hmm.
It's the motive. It's the judging people with the thought, I would never do that. That's
Mm-hmm.
the potential for that's not in me. You're less than I am. Trying to turn. It's the spiritual arrogance. That's the judging, right? Because we can never call sin sin.
Yeah.
And what Jesus is saying here, because he would be contradicting himself.
Yeah.
The one that said, don't judge, right? So what Jesus is saying here is look at their fruit.
Yeah.
Take their lives and measure their lives against all this stuff I just taught you. And to your point, Shayla, don't do it arrogantly like you're superior to them. Don't do it like you ain't got the same potential within you to fall short. Jesus says, look at their lives. What road are they on? But if they're on the wide road, they can't lead you to the narrow road. If they've gone through the wrong gate, they can't lead you through the right gate. If they're on a path that leads to death, they can't lead you to life. My pastor used to say this: you can't teach what you don't know, you can't lead where you don't go, and you can't give what you don't have. So Jesus is saying here, he's saying, guys, listen. Watch the direction. Watch who's giving you direction. And be discerning about them. Look at the fruit in their lives. He said, you can't pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles. And in other words, if you want the life of the kingdom, you can't get that from somebody on the wide road. You can't get grapes from thorns, right? If you want the life of the kingdom, it can only come from that which is associated with the kingdom. And then he gives this analogy about fruit. Good tree produces good fruit, bad tree produces bad fruit, right? And a bad tree can't produce good fruit? He says you're going to know them.
Yeah.
19 and 20, he says, so every tree that does not produce good fruit is chopped down and thrown into the fire. And again, we've often thought about that when it says thrown into the fire, about hell. Like so many times as Christians, we're so like fixated on making sure somebody's going to hell, right? We just like everything is hell, right? We're so
Yeah.
fixated on making sure somebody's going to hell. But what that's really saying is, remember, the wide road leads to destruction. That's what it's talking about. That when there's not the right fruit in your life, what do they do with a tree that doesn't bear fruit? They cut it down, they chop it down, they turn it into firewood. It leads to ruin. Verse 20, just as you can identify a tree by its fruit, so you can identify people by their actions. So what is Jesus saying? What's the road that you're traveling on?
Yeah.
And if you want to be on the right road, you got to understand something. The entrance into the kingdom, it's constrained. It costs. There's limits. And the road is difficult because I have to keep dying to self every day. I have to keep dying to self every day. And I live in a world that is fundamentally in opposition to me as a child of the kingdom. And putting people in political office ain't going to change that. The world is fundamentally against me as a Christian. Fundamentally. Jesus says you got to watch who you're receiving direction from. You have to have a discernment, and you got to be able to look at their lives. So what are the actions he's saying that we ought to judge? It comes back to this. Is this principle operating in their life? Is this principle operating in their life? Because if this principle is operating in their lives, then the likelihood that you're going to see these attributes, which are the basis and foundation of being able to do all the other things that Jesus has talked about in the Sermon on the Mount, the likelihood that there's capacity to do that would be greater. The Beatitudes create the basis of room in my heart for the Holy Spirit to come in and produce its fruit in my life. When the Holy Spirit produces the fruit in my life, then the likelihood of me manifesting the moral character of God is increased. So we have a choice. After all this teaching, Jesus says, you got a choice. And I can tell, here's what he said. I can tell what you've chosen. You see, the wide road is the okey-doke road. The wide road is the okey-doke road. That's the kingdom of darkness. Satan never says, hey, come follow me to hell. He always says, hey, God's trying to keep something from you. Remember when he told Eve? He didn't say, Eve, go on and eat that fruit. And you and Adam can send all of your posterity into judgment and condemnation. No. He said, God's trying to keep something from you. The wide gate, the easy path, going with the crowd, all that leads to death. The kingdom, it's narrow. It's difficult. Don't run with the crowd. It leads to life. You know, the thing about the crowd is everybody always wants to follow a crowd, right? It's just natural. Oh man, there's a whole bunch of people over there. Let's go see what's going on over there. Oh man, there's a crowd outside. Back when we could gather. Man, there's a crowd outside the restaurant. Man, that food must be good. Let's go over there. But God says, no. Spiritually, crowds aren't necessarily good. Spiritually, you're better off with the few. So here, we'll close with this. So here's what Jesus is saying to us. There's only two ways to live this life. There's the hard way and the easy way. The hard way, that's the the easy way is the okey-doke way. That's what that's what the kingdom of darkness says. The kingdom of light, God's kingdom, is hard. And what this contrast gives us, there's no middle road. I want to say that again. There's no middle road. So like, ask yourself this question. What road am I on? That's for you and God to work out. What road am I on? There's no middle ground. There's no middle road. There's no neutral groups. You're either with the few or the many. And there's only two possible destinations: death or life. That's it. And oftentimes we teach Christianity in a way to cause people to think that there's something in the middle. There isn't. Can I be honest with you about something? I wish there was something in the middle. You know what I mean? I wish there was this kind of, but there ain't. There ain't. That's what Jesus is laying out for us. The same way Moses said to the people of God, you got to decide life or death, blessings and a curse. Now Jesus, the new Moses, in the Sermon on the Mount, is saying to you and I, you got to decide. You have to decide. Because what choice you make is going to determine what flows into your life. Remember, I always said this, the devil can't keep you from what God has for you. Your neighbor can't keep you from what God has for you. Your haters can't keep you from what God has for you. The only person that can keep you from what God has for you is who?
You.
It's you. If you choose, if we decide to embrace the narrow gate, to embrace the difficult path, to run with the few, everything God has for you, that thing deep down in your heart that in the middle of the night when you are laying there trying to sleep and you've got this tension between where your life is and the thing on the inside of you that says there's more. This isn't all there is. There's more out there. Ask yourself, what road am I on? because your Father desires to give you the kingdom.